Hello and welcome to the race edition of the Race Weekend's data analysis for the Hungarian Grand Prix. Now, it was an extremely hectic Grand Prix where a lot of drivers ended up retiring, so the teammate comparison section is a teensy bit sparse, so this video may be a little bit shorter than the other race editions that we have done this season. But with that out of the way, everything is still timestamped in the description down below, so please feel free to skip to whichever section you would like me to talk about. But with all of that out of the way, we will jump on into the race data for the Hungarian Grand Prix and take a brief look at the overall positions table. The bottom 6 positions are all missing. We have Antonio Giovinazzi all the way at the top in the Alfa Romeo, consistently last due to his 10-second time penalty during the race, and then we have Esteban Ocon comfortably leading near enough every single laps. A couple in the opening portion of the Grand Prix, and then also a couple at the pit stop phase where Fernando Alonso actually led the Grand Prix for just 2 laps. We can then see the extremely impressive drive from Lewis Hamilton to charge through that field, where he ended up catching Fernando Alonso at around lap 48 to lap 50, and it took him double digits of laps, around 15, to get past on lap 64. And then from lap 64, it was 2 laps to catch and pass Carlos Sainz, and then 2 laps to catch and unfortunately not quite pass Sebastian Vettel. If there was 1 extra lap, Hamilton would have got past Sebastian Vettel. So if he'd have got past Alonso 5 or maybe 6 laps earlier, he'd have definitely gone on to possibly win that race. I realise saying definitely and possibly in the same sentence doesn't really make any sense and a tiny bit of a contradiction, but there you go. And now we'll just take a look at the overall lap time chart for the Hungarian Grand Prix. Now, I'm not entirely sure what happened at laps number 2 and 4 for some of these drivers, and then again at the end. I've tried to find the root cause of this issue, but I don't know where Excel is pulling these numbers from because they don't exist in any of the tables. But hey ho, we just have some little vertical lines in the graph. And as we always do, we can zoom in on the section that is most important to us, excluding all of the pit stops and looking at the overall layers of racing, and we can see 3 very nice and clear bands in this opening portion, with Esteban Ocon and Sebastian Vettel leading the way for the first couple of laps, with Nicholas Latifi actually holding up the rest of the field, allowing them to extend their lead to about 12 to 13 seconds. There is then a chasing pack at the back that consists of pretty much everybody else. Then post first round of pit stops, there are still 3 bands of racing, a little bit more difficult to pinpoint, but they are roughly there. And then at the end, there's once again 3 bands of racing. And we can see consistently that Lewis Hamilton was at one stage 3.5 seconds faster than anybody else on the track. That is absolutely ridiculous. From lap 49 to about lap 54. So for 5 consecutive laps, he was at least 1 second faster than anybody else on the track. And then again at the very end, after he had cleared Fernando Alonso, he was catching Sebastian Vettel at a rate of knots, around 1.5 to 2 seconds per lap. But what we can do now is we can isolate each driver's clean air laps and then average them accordingly, and unsurprisingly, it is Lewis Hamilton who tops this list. And he tops this by a very significant margin, by just over 9/10 of a second to Carlos Sainz, and then interestingly 1.1 back to Max Verstappen, the wounded Max Verstappen, who was faster than everybody else in clean air on the track. Admittedly, Verstappen only had 10 clean air laps, as he was pretty much for the whole race stuck behind Daniel Ricciardo, compared to the likes of Ocon and Alonso and Vettel, etc., who had 30 plus. Didn't mean to say Vettel. Vettel actually had the least, as he was stuck behind Ocon the whole Grand Prix. Vettel only had 8. So we have the overall average lap in this column here, with the gaps just to the right of it. We then have the gaps expressed as a percentage in order for me to be able to compare each of the Grand Prix that we have had this season. We then have the number of clean air laps that each driver drove during this entire Grand Prix, with the percentage of the race as well, and then their standard deviation throughout this stint. But taking that middle percentage column and averaging out the 11 races that we have had this season, we end up with an overall driver pace percentage table that looks a little bit like this. Max Verstappen is still the fastest driver of 2021, closely followed by Sergio Perez, and now extremely closely followed by Lewis Hamilton. Then doing exactly the same thing but for the teams, we have Mercedes once again clawing ever so closer back to Red Bull. However, I'm not 100% sure if this is Mercedes legitimately closing in pace-wise on Red Bull, or just the fact that Red Bull have had 2 races where they haven't really been anywhere near the top of this table and been able to compete. I'm not quite sure just yet if it's actually that. But now we take a look visually at exactly where each driver's clean air laps popped up, and we can see that it's a little bit sporadic, especially for Lewis Hamilton. He had a couple in laps 19, 21 and 24, then he had 3 in a row from 32 to 34, then he had a bunch after he pitted, going extremely quickly, catching up to Fernando Alonso, and then after getting past Alonso, he then had a couple more. Whereas for a driver like Esteban Ocon in the middle, you can see he had a whole bunch from lap 24 all the way up to 35, and then from 40 all the way to the checkered flag. Exactly the same for the 2 Williams. Now, in order to account for the fact that clean air laps set in the second half of the race are therefore going to be quicker than those set in the first half of the race, I'm now going to do exactly the same analysis, but just for each stint. So for stint number 1, every single driver was on the medium compound. I'm excluding the intermediate stint as it just wasn't long enough and everyone pitted after 2 laps. So each driver's medium stint looked a little bit like this, with Carlos Sainz actually coming out on top, with Hamilton, Tsunoda, Raikkonen and also Russell being on the medium compound of tyre, however not setting any clean air laps in this stint. So we have Carlos Sainz followed by Pierre Gasly and then Fernando Alonso, with Esteban Ocon also there, very, very close to his teammate. With stint number 2, where everybody was on the hards, looking a little bit like this, Fernando Alonso actually topping this leaderboard from Lewis Hamilton only just, but bear in mind Hamilton's hard stint wasn't that long, whereas everyone's second hard stint pretty much went to the end of the Grand Prix. With only a few drivers actually running a stint number 3, those being Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Pierre Gasly and Kimi Raikkonen. Now, because there were only a couple of drivers that actually ran them and each of them ran it on different tyres, Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton went onto the mediums and then Pierre Gasly and Kimi Raikkonen went onto the softs. I'm not really going to compare them because there just really isn't anything to compare it to. But what we're going to do now is we're going to break down each of the teammate battles. Everything is timestamped in the description below, so please feel free to skip to whichever team you would like me to talk about. But like I said at the start of the video, it's going to be a touch sparse as quite a lot of the drivers retired on lap number 1, so there literally is no data to compare. And then finally we are going in 2020 championship order, so we start with Mercedes and we'll end with Williams. And on screen is the Mercedes lap time chart, and again, no data for Valtteri Bottas. But in the top left is their lap time chart. In the grey dotted line is the fastest car for Mercedes in the previous Hungarian Grand Prix in 2020. So we can see how their pace compares this year to their pace last year. Then we've got Lewis Hamilton's individual positions chart, and we can see his significant gain that he was making all race up until he got stuck behind Fernando Alonso, where when he got past Fernando Alonso, he was making as equally significant gains. So like I said at the start, if he'd have got past 5 or 6 laps earlier, he could have definitely been in with a shout of winning this race. But taking a more closer look at the overall lap time pace of the Mercedes, in 2020 clean air, their average lap time was a 1:19.125, and this was 1.8 seconds faster than Hamilton's average competitive clean air lap this race. And then breaking down the stints for the 2 Mercedes, Hamilton didn't set any competitive clean air laps in stint number 1, nor did Bottas as he retired. And then in stint number 2, Hamilton on his small little hard run in the middle of the race did a 1:21.771. Then from Mercedes, we'll take a look at Red Bull, and once again, there is literally no teammate comparisons that I can make whatsoever. But again, we can see the significant difference in lap time from their 2020 pace to their 2021 pace. However, 2021 pace was significantly hampered by at least 7/10 per lap. So what we can do instead is we can take a look at their overall pace, and we can see that 2020's clean air lap pace was a 1:20.682, which was 1.4 seconds quicker than Max Verstappen's hampered 1:22.088. With stint number 1 looking a little bit like this, Verstappen setting a 24 flat, and then stint number 2, Verstappen not actually setting any competitive clean air lap times. So from Red Bull, we'll now take a look at McLaren. Now there's a little bit of teammate comparisons that we can make with this one. Not a lot, just a little bit, as Norris did actually set 2 laps. So we have 2 laps worth of McLaren gaps, one set at just over nothing, around 2/10, and then one at just over 8 seconds. And then again, taking a look at the lap chart in that top left, we can see the grey dotted line was significantly faster in the second half of the race overall compared to Daniel Ricciardo. But again, Ricciardo did have a race worth of damage, much like Max Verstappen, but nowhere near as significant, but he did have damage. So the McLaren's pace overall in 2020 was a 1:20.735, with Ricciardo being 3.2 seconds per lap slower with a 1:23.969. And stint number 1, Ricciardo was just a little bit slower than Max Verstappen by just 0.4 with a 1:24.485. Compared to his stint 2 pace on the hards, he was actually quicker, but that's probably because he was burning a little bit of fuel and getting a little bit better used to the damaged car that he had, which is not optimal. Then from McLaren, we will take a look at yet another team that doesn't have any teammate comparisons that I can make, and that is Aston Martin. And we can see a significant pace difference between their 2020 pace and their 2021 pace, to the extent that I've actually chopped off the bottom half of their 2021 or their 2020 pace. It's just a couple of seconds a lap quicker. And taking a look at that significant difference, we can see that 2020's pace was a 1:20.8, and then 2.5 seconds slower was Sebastian Vettel on a 1:23.3. Now, interestingly, Sebastian Vettel easily had the quicker car than Esteban Ocon. However, he just couldn't quite get past. You need around 2 seconds, 1.5 to 2 seconds per lap advantage on the car ahead to perform a decent overtake. And he couldn't quite get that done. He wasn't quite that quick over Esteban Ocon. His only chance came at that pit stop phase, where he was so close to actually performing the undercut. If his team had actually done a relatively decent pit stop, not 3.3 seconds, if it was 2.5, he would have ended up coming out on top, and then we would have seen his proper pace in clean air. But Sebastian Vettel's stint 1 pace was actually fairly competitive, a 1:23.3 on the mediums, and unfortunately not setting any competitive clean air laps on the hards. And then from Aston Martin, we'll move halfway into the field and look at Alpine, and we do have some teammate data to finally have a look at. So we will start in the bottom right with their percentage pace difference, Alonso to Ocon. This takes all of Fernando Alonso's lap times and divides them all by Esteban Ocon's lap times and converts them all to a percentage. It orders these percentages from largest down to smallest, and then any percentage above 100 is where Fernando Alonso is going faster, and then any percentage below 100 is when Esteban Ocon is going faster. So we can split this percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 51.4% of the laps raced, it was Esteban Ocon that was the faster car, and therefore for 48.6%, it was Fernando Alonso. Actually, exceptionally even, considering Ocon ran this entire race at the front, and Alonso was having to defend and battle all this way. That is exceptionally even. But we can see the enormous pace deficit in the opening stint, where Alonso was held up in that queue behind Nicholas Latifi, where Ocon was able to extend the gap to almost 20 seconds. He was easily a second per lap quicker than Fernando Alonso. However, once Fernando Alonso had cleared Nicholas Latifi, he was able to match and go quicker than Esteban Ocon overall, bringing the gap down to 15 seconds until they both came in for their pit stops. Esteban Ocon coming in first, allowing Alonso to get past and briefly take the lead before Alonso came in just a couple of laps later, where straight after the pit stop, Alonso was able to go significantly faster, around 0.8 of a second for about 10 laps. They then matched pace pretty much all the way until the end of the Grand Prix. And we can take a look at Alpine's overall 2020 pace, which was 1.3 seconds per lap slower than Esteban Ocon, who was a 10th faster than Fernando Alonso in clean air. But bear in mind, this was over the whole duration of the Grand Prix, so if we take a look at stint number 1, it was actually Alonso who was the faster car in stint number 1. And then in stint number 2, he was also the faster car by half a second on the hard compound of tyre. And then from Alpine, we will take a look at Ferrari, and again there is no teammate data that we can compare as Charles Leclerc retired on lap number 1. But interestingly, the pace difference of Carlos Sainz to their 2020 pace is very, very even. But if we average it all out, it actually comes to a second per lap loss to their 2020 pace. With Carlos Sainz's stint number 1 pace being very, very quick. He was mighty quick on the medium compound of tyre in the opening phase, and then he was even quicker still on the hard compound of tyre in the end of the Grand Prix. Then from Ferrari we will take a look at Alfa Tauri, and there is some teammate data that we can compare between Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda. We can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 27.1% of the laps raced, it was Yuki Tsunoda who was the faster car, and then for 72.9%, it was Pierre Gasly. With interestingly Gasly being incredibly slow in the first opening laps. I know he was slightly caught up in the first lap incident where he had to go wide. He wasn't involved in any of the damage, but he wasn't able to even close up to Yuki Tsunoda, who was held up by Nicholas Latifi. He was the second car in the queue, directly behind the Canadian. However, Yuki comes in for an extremely early pit stop, which does relinquish Pierre Gasly. Gasly then comes in for his stop a couple of laps later, not just after like we saw with a couple of the other teams. And then after this pit stop, Pierre Gasly is comfortably the quicker car by about 2 or 3 tenths per lap, where that small little spike just to the right of the green arrow for Yuki Tsunoda in the white is the team order pass where he slowed down significantly to let Pierre Gasly through. And then even after that pass where Yuki Tsunoda was complaining that Gasly wasn't going quicker, he was going quicker by about 2 or 3 tenths per lap. They then both come in for a second set of pit stops right at the very end, where Pierre Gasly ended up going for the fastest lap, whereas Yuki Tsunoda just came in for a second stop. With the overall AlphaTauri pace looking a little bit like this, 2020 was half a second quicker than Pierre Gasly's 122.219, which was 7 tenths faster overall than Yuki Tsunoda in clean air across the entire Grand Prix. With stint number 1 looking a bit like this, Gasly setting the pace at 122.9, but Tsunoda not setting any clean air laps in stint number 1. And then in stint number 2, not entirely sure where it's pulling all of these numbers from, but stint number 2, it said that can't be right. So somewhere there must be a lap between stint number 1 and stint number 2 where Yuki Tsunoda set a clean air lap in order to have a time in the whole race. I'm going to have to check my code on that one. Something has gone just a little bit wrong with the AlphaTauri comparisons. The whole race is correct 100%, but the stint code, that may have broken just a little bit for AlphaTauri. But from AlphaTauri and their slightly broken stint comparison, we'll take a look at Alfa Romeo. And splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 37.7% of the Grand Prix, it was Giovinazzi in the white who was the faster car, and therefore for 62.3%, it was Kimi Räikkönen. Now, this was a really poor race for Alfa Romeo, with 2 significant hefty penalties which absolutely ruined their chances of scoring points. And we can see that just here for Antonio Giovinazzi in their lap chart in the white, which extends the gap all the way to 35 seconds. This was his 10-second time penalty that he had to serve, whereas Kimi Räikkönen had to come in for a 10-second stop and go penalty for causing a collision, or it was the other way around. I can't remember exactly which way around it was. So it was actually Antonio Giovinazzi who received the 10-second stop and go, and that was for speeding in the pit lane, whereas Kimi Räikkönen was just given a 10-second time penalty for causing a collision in the pit lane with Nikita Mazepin. Then post all of this calamitous penalty issues with Alfa Romeo, they were extremely even in pace, with Räikkönen ahead of Giovinazzi. However, they come in for a second round of pit stops, or at least Giovinazzi does, which extends the gap to almost 25 seconds. Then about 20 laps or so later, it is Kimi Räikkönen who comes in, which decreases the gap from just over 25 seconds to around 5. However, Kimi Räikkönen is easily able to go 1 second per lap faster than Giovinazzi overall in the second half of the race to end at just over 20 seconds. With Alfa Romeo's overall pace compared to 2020 being 1 second per lap slower than the Kimi Räikkönen's pace, who was 1.4 seconds quicker than Antonio Giovinazzi. with stint number 1 looking a bit like this, Gio being the only one to set some clean air laps in stint number 1. However, in stint number 2, it was Raikkonen on the hard compound of tyre who was easily the quicker car. Then penultimately, we can take a look at the Haas team, which once again, very similarly to McLaren, we can only take a look at a brief segment of laps where Nikita Mazepin was running until he was taken out by the unsafe release for Kimi Raikkonen. But what we can do instead is we can compare Mick Schumacher's pace to their 2020 pace, which overall was 1.6 seconds a lap slower. Now honestly, that isn't too bad for Haas, as they have always been at the bottom of these lists comparing their pace to previous seasons, whereas this is in the middle ground of what we have seen pace-wise this year. And then Mick Schumacher's pace in stint number 1 was a 24.7 on the mediums, and then a 23.222 on the hards. And then finally, we will take a look at Williams, which is the last team that we can look at, and the last team that actually has some teammate comparisons. Splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle, for 60% exactly, it was Nicholas Latifi in the blue, who was the faster Williams, and for 40% exactly, it was George Russell. And it was in the opening phase of the Grand Prix where Latifi really stretched his legs over George Russell. He was about half a second to 0.2 a lap quicker for around 25 laps, up until their first set of pit stops where the gap rose to just over 30 seconds in the Canadians' favour as George Russell pitted first, and then Latifi came in just after. Where both drivers were running exceptionally even up until here around lap 52, where Nicholas Latifi starts to slightly drop off and George Russell slightly pick up the pace a little bit to again where there's about a second a lap difference between the two in George Russell's favour. But ultimately a very strong race for Williams and a double point score, bringing home 10 points. But what we can do now is look at the overall pace compared to 2020, and they were a second faster in 2020, which honestly, that is not bad whatsoever. That's one of the best time losses that we have had in this grid for Hungary. With George Russell overall having the better clean air lap pace over the entire Grand Prix, which is 0.4 quicker than Nicholas Latifi. Stint number 1, Russell didn't set any clean air laps, and then in stint number 2, it looked a little bit like this. Latifi was 0.3 down. And there we go, there is the end of the race edition of the Race Weekend Data Analysis for the Hungarian Grand Prix. I hope you have enjoyed, and please let me know of anything down below in the comments that you have thought about today's episode, or anything that you thought of the Grand Prix. But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.